She walked into the grand ballroom of Ashford Hall with a bruise hidden beneath her silk gloves and a smile painted over a scream no one had ever bothered to hear. Her name was Séraphin Dallaire, and in a room full of lords, ladies, and gentlemen who had watched her suffer for 3 quiet years, not one turned their head, except him, Aldric Beausoleil, the Duke of Ravenshire, a man they whispered about in darkened hallways, a man whose name alone made grown men straighten their spines and women forget how to breathe. He wasn't supposed to notice her. Men like him never did. But tonight, his cold, calculating eyes found hers across that glittering room, and he did not look away. Why? What did the most ruthless man in all of the Dominion see in a woman the world had already decided meant nothing? Oh, darlings, this story is only just beginning. What do you think Aldric saw in her that no one else could? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want to find out what happens when the cruelest duke in the Regency reaches for the most broken woman in the room, subscribe right now, because the next part will change everything you think you know about both of them. Séraphin Dallaire had learned very early in life that pain was something you swallowed quietly, like cold tea, unpleasant, unwanted, but manageable if you simply refused to make a face. She stood at the edge of the Ashford Hall ballroom, her ivory gown pressed perfectly against her frame, her dark hair pinned with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was the only armor a woman of her position was permitted to carry. Around her wrist, beneath the silk glove, the bruise throbbed, slow and insistent, like a second heartbeat she had not asked for. She had not asked for any of it. Not the marriage to Lord Fenwick Calloway, a man whose charm existed exclusively in public and whose cruelty lived exclusively behind closed doors. Not the 3 years of careful silence. Not the way she had learned to count the seconds between his footsteps on the staircase, bracing herself before he even reached the landing. Not the way she had taught herself to smile so convincingly that even the women who called themselves her friends never once thought to ask if she was all right. They would not ask tonight either. She could see them from where she stood. Lady Orville Thibault laughing behind her fan near the fireplace, Countess Madeleine Pressot lifting her champagne flute with ringed fingers, their eyes skimming over Séraphin the same way they always did, not unkindly, simply without interest. She was part of the furniture of their social world. Decorative, forgettable, present enough to fill a seat, but not significant enough to hold a gaze. That was fine. She had stopped needing their gaze a long time ago. What she needed tonight was to survive the evening without Fenwick noticing the way she had flinched when Lord Olet shook her hand at the door, pressing too firmly, too suddenly, and the bruise had lit up like fire beneath the silk. She had recovered quickly, she always did. A breath, a blink, a small rearrangement of her expression, and no one was the wiser. She was very good at disappearing inside herself. What she was not good at, what she had never once in her 24 years managed to prepare for, was the specific and disorienting sensation of being seen. It started at the back of her neck, a warmth, a pressure, the particular weight of eyes that did not look away when they should. She turned her head slowly, the way you turn toward a sound you are not entirely sure you heard, half convinced you have imagined it. She had not imagined it. Aldric Beausoleil stood on the upper landing of the ballroom staircase, one gloved hand resting against the carved oak banister, and he was looking directly at her, not past her, not through her. Directly, deliberately, unmistakably at her. She felt her breath shift. He was not a man who required an introduction in any room he entered. The rooms rearranged themselves around him before anyone thought to speak his name. He was tall in the way that suggested consequence rather than mere height, broad-shouldered beneath an immaculate black coat that made every other gentleman in the hall look as though they were wearing their father's clothes. His jaw was sharp enough to draw blood, and his expression carried the settled certainty of someone who had long since stopped wondering whether he was the most dangerous person present and simply accepted it as fact. The Duke of Ravenshire, 31 years of age, unmarried, uninterested in being otherwise, possessed of a fortune so vast it had stopped being impressive and simply become geological, like a mountain, a feature of the landscape rather than an achievement. He had fought in the northern conflicts before his title fell to him. He had come back with something different behind his eyes. No one spoke about what that was. No one asked. People did not ask Aldric Beausoleil things they were not prepared to hear answered honestly. She had seen him at perhaps 4 events in the last 3 years. They had never spoken. She had not expected they ever would. He existed in an entirely different tier of the social world. Not above it, not exactly, but sideways from it, as though he had constructed a parallel version of the Regency aristocracy that operated by his rules alone, and merely tolerated the original out of mild amusement. He should not have been looking at her. She broke the gaze first. She was not embarrassed. She was practical. Women in her position did not hold the stares of powerful men. It led to questions. Questions led to conversations. Conversations in the wrong ears led back to Fenwick. She lifted her champagne flute and turned slightly toward the nearest window, letting the candlelight catch her profile in what she hoped read as casual indifference. Her heart was doing something unreasonable. She pressed the glass to her lips and breathed. Across the room she heard the particular sound of the staircase, one deliberate step, then another. Unhurried, certain. The kind of footfall that parted crowds without trying simply because something in the rhythm of it communicated that stopping was not a concept the owner had ever personally entertained. She did not turn around. She would not turn around. She counted the heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, 4. The noise of the ballroom continued. Music, laughter, the crystalline percussion of glass on glass, and then quite suddenly, without ceremony or preamble, a voice arrived at her shoulder like a verdict. "You are in pain." It was not a question. She turned then, because there was nothing else to do, and found Aldric Beausoleil standing close enough that she could see the fine stitching on his lapel and the particular quality of his eyes. Grey, she noted, not the cold grey of winter stone, but something more complex, something that held depth the way deep water holds darkness. He was not looking at her face, he was looking at her wrist. She felt the world compress into a single airless moment. How had he seen it? The glove was intact. The seam sat exactly where it should. She had checked in the carriage mirror twice. In the candlelight of the entrance hall once more. There was nothing to see. There was nothing that anyone should have been able to. "The way you held the champagne flute," he said, his voice low enough that it belonged only to her. "Your right hand compensated. You have been favouring the left all evening." She stared at him. 3 years. 3 years of careful performance, of studied normalcy, of convincing an entire social world that she was simply a quiet woman with a quiet life and nothing worth examining. 3 years of invisible. And this man, this cold, reputedly ruthless, deliberately unknowable man, had watched her for less than 20 minutes and read what no one else had bothered to look for. Something cracked open behind her sternum. Small, dangerous. "I turned my ankle," she said. "Earlier this afternoon. I must have been compensating without realizing." The words were smooth, automatic. She had a catalogue of them. He looked at her then fully. Finally, the way a man looks at something he is deciding how much of his attention it deserves. "Of course," he said. He did not believe her. She could see that he did not believe her. It lived plainly in the stillness of his expression, in the way he did not nod or smile or perform the polite acceptance that social grace required. He simply held her gaze with those deep grey eyes and let the silence between them say what neither of them would. Her pulse was loud in her ears. "Your Grace," she said carefully, because she needed to end this, because Fenwick was somewhere in this room, and she could not afford whatever this was. "I don't believe we have been formally introduced." "No," he agreed, "we have not. He did not offer his name, he did not need to, and he did not move. He simply stood there in the amber light of 100 candles, looking at her the way no one had looked at her in longer than she could accurately remember, as though she was something worth the trouble of actually seeing. And that, she realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, was the most frightening thing that had happened to her all evening, including the bruise. Who was this man really, beneath the title and the reputation and those impossible grey eyes? And why, out of every woman in that glittering, crowded room, had he chosen to see her? If you need to know what happens when Séraphin can no longer keep her carefully built walls standing, and what Aldric Beausoleil decides to do about the things he now knows, subscribe right now. Séraphin had not always been this careful. There was a version of her that existed before Fenwick, a younger, louder, less calculated version who laughed without checking first to see who was watching. A girl who had grown up in the modest but dignified Dallaire household in the outskirts of Quebec society, the second daughter of a man who loved books more than ambition, and a mother who had worn her disappointments so long they had become part of her posture. Séraphin had been the bright one, the one with opinions, the one her father would call into his study on winter afternoons to read aloud from his collections while snow pressed itself quietly against the window panes. She had believed, with the particular confidence of a girl who has not yet learned what the world costs, that being bright would be enough. It was not enough. When her father died, suddenly, without warning, between one breath and the next on an ordinary Tuesday morning, everything that had felt solid revealed itself to be scaffolding. The house, the modest income, the sense that the Dallaire name still carried the quiet weight it once had, all of it dismantled with a speed that had left her mother hollow-eyed, and her older sister Celestine quietly desperate in the way that only women, with no options, learn to be desperate, without making a sound. Fenwick Calloway had arrived into that silence like an answer to a question Séraphin had not wanted to ask. He was handsome then, attentive. He had a way of making you feel as though you were the only person in any room he entered, which she understood now was not love but technique. Something he had practiced and perfected the way other men practiced cards or riding. He had spoken to her mother with warmth. He had looked at Séraphin as though she was extraordinary. He had proposed within 4 months, and her mother had wept with relief, and Celestine had squeezed her hand at the altar, and Séraphin had told herself that the small cold unease she felt standing beside him was simply nerves. It was not nerves. She understood that fully by the 3rd month of marriage. By the 1st year she had built the walls. By the 2nd she had furnished them. By the 3rd she was living so entirely inside her own constructed interior that the outer Séraphin, the one who smiled and dressed and attended events and said all the correct things at all the correct moments, felt like a separate person she occasionally borrowed. She did not let herself grieve the girl she had been. Grief required stillness, and stillness was dangerous. She kept moving. She kept performing. She kept surviving. That was enough. It had to be enough. She repeated this to herself now, standing at the ballroom window with Aldric Beausoleil occupying the space beside her like a weather system, present, impossible to ignore, carrying the particular atmospheric pressure of someone who had not yet decided what he intended to do, but had absolutely decided he was not leaving. She needed him to leave. She needed him to walk back up that staircase and return to whatever remote, untouchable corner of this social world he normally inhabited, and forget that he had seen her compensate for a bruise she was not supposed to have. Instead he said quietly, "How long have you been married to Calloway?" Her grip tightened on the champagne flute. 3 years, she said, keeping her voice level, keeping her eyes on the middle distance, keeping everything contained the way she always kept everything contained. "And before that, I don't see how that is relevant, Your Grace." "No," he said, "I don't imagine you do." There was something in the way he spoke, not unkind, not intrusive, but steady in a way that suggested he was not asking out of social curiosity. He was asking the way a man asks when he already suspects the shape of the answer, and is simply waiting to see if you trust him enough to confirm it. She did not trust him. She did not trust anyone. Trust was a luxury that required safety, and safety was something Séraphin Dallaire had stopped budgeting for a long time ago. And yet, she turned to look at him despite herself, just briefly, just for a single unguarded second, and found him already watching her with that same quality of attention that had unsteadied her from across the room. Up close it was worse. Up close it was the kind of attention that made you feel located, found. Like a lamp being lit in a room that had been dark so long it had forgotten darkness was not its natural state. She looked away again. Quickly, her heart was doing it again. That unreasonable, inconvenient, deeply unhelpful thing it had no business doing. "You should be careful," she said softly. And she was not certain which of them she was warning. Aldric Beausoleil did not do things without reason. This was perhaps the most important thing that the people who feared him understood about him, and the most important thing that the people who underestimated him did not. He was not impulsive, he was not cruel for the pleasure of it, the way some men of his standing allowed themselves to be simply because no one had ever made cruelty inconvenient for them. He was deliberate. Everything he did, every word, every silence, every calculated entry into a room, was the result of a mind that processed the world with the cold efficiency of a man who had learned very young that emotion without direction was simply damage waiting for a location. He had learned that in the north. In the conflicts that people in ballrooms like this one discussed in the abstract, as though war was a concept rather than a smell, a sound, a specific weight of another man going still in your arms in the grey morning mud. He had come back from that with something rearranged inside him, not broken. He had never allowed himself the indulgence of broken, but recalibrated, stripped of everything unnecessary. He did not spend attention the way other men spent money, carelessly on things that returned nothing, which was why he could not entirely account for what he was doing standing beside Séraphin Dallaire at a ballroom window while the rest of Ashford Hall's finest continued their social performance around them. He had noticed her the moment he reached the landing, not because she was the most striking woman in the room, though she was, with that dark hair and the quality of stillness she wore like a second gown, but because of the way she was standing. He had spent years learning to read bodies the way other men read documents. Posture was language, micro-movements were confession, and Séraphin Dallaire was standing with the particular controlled tension of someone who was managing pain, and had been managing it for long enough that the management itself had become unconscious. He had watched her for 7 minutes before he descended the stairs. In those 7 minutes he had noted the compensation in her left hand, the fractional delay in her response when Lord Ulet had gripped her hand at the door, the way her smile after that moment had been rebuilt rather than resumed, assembled piece by piece, consciously, the way you reassemble something after it has been knocked apart. He had also noted Lord Fenwick Calloway moving through the room with the loud, back-slapping ease of a man entirely confident in his own reputation, and he had noted the precise moment when Calloway's eyes had swept the room and found his wife, and the almost imperceptible shift in Seraphin's posture when she registered being found. That shift had told him everything he needed to know. He had come down the stairs anyway. Now she was telling him to be careful, and looking at the middle distance with that locked, composed expression, and he was standing close enough to see the small muscle in her jaw working, holding everything in place through sheer will, and he felt something move in the deep, quiet part of him that he generally kept under strict administrative control. "Calloway is watching us," he said. She did not react visibly. That itself was telling, the absence of surprise. The absence of the nervous flutter most women would have produced at being observed by their husbands. Instead, she simply absorbed the information with the stillness of someone who had learned that reacting was more dangerous than knowing. Then perhaps this conversation should end, she said. Perhaps. He did not move. Does he know you are here tonight with a bruise beneath that glove? The muscle in her jaw tightened. I told you, she said, very quietly, very evenly. I turned my ankle. You told me a story, he said. I am asking what actually happened. She turned to face him fully then, and he saw it, the flash of something raw and genuine behind the composure. There and gone in less than a second, but real anger, he thought. Not at him specifically, at the situation, at the corner she was in, at the fact that he had seen through her and she could not decide whether that was relief or catastrophe. You do not know me, she said. You do not know my life, and whatever you think you have observed, Your Grace, I would strongly advise you to revise your conclusions and return to your evening. My evening, he said, was considerably less interesting before you were in it. She stared at him. He watched her try to determine whether that was flirtation and arrive at the correct answer, which was that it was not. It was simply true. He had come to Ashford Hall tonight because Viscount Reynard had requested his presence regarding a land dispute, and Aldric had tolerated the first hour out of professional courtesy before retreating to the landing to assess his options for a dignified early departure. He had not been planning to stay. He was now revising that plan. I want to help you, he said, simply, without architecture or ornament, because he had found over the years that plain words landed with more force than elaborate ones, and force was sometimes the only thing that reached through walls well built as hers. Something moved across her face, complicated and swift, like weather. People do not help for nothing, she said. No, he agreed, they generally do not. Then what do you want in return? He considered her for a long moment. The candlelight was doing something particular to the angles of her face, and he noted this with the same detached precision with which he noted everything, filing it alongside the intelligence in her eyes, and the steadiness in her voice, and the way she was holding herself together with what he estimated was a significant and ongoing expenditure of personal courage. I want to know the truth, he said. That is all, not for leverage, not for social currency. I have enough of both and no interest in accumulating more at your expense. He paused. Simply the truth. Because I think you have been carrying it alone for long enough that you have started to believe that is the only way it can be carried. The silence between them was different now, less defensive, more exposed. She looked at him for a long moment, and he let her look, let her take whatever time she needed to decide whether he was another trap or something else entirely, because he understood that a woman who had learned to read danger the way she clearly had deserved the space to make that assessment without being rushed. Then across the room, Fenwick Calloway laughed. That large, room-filling laugh, and Seraphin's eyes moved to him involuntarily, and when they came back to Aldric, they were different, still guarded. But underneath the guard, something that looked, for just a moment, terrifyingly like hope. You cannot help me, she said, but her voice had changed, the certainty had developed a fracture. I have not yet tried, he said. And then Fenwick was moving through the crowd toward them, his broad smile leading the way, and Séraphin straightened almost imperceptibly, that automatic practiced bracing, and Aldric felt something cold and clarifying move through him as he watched it happen, watched her put herself back together in real time, watched her rebuild the performance in the 3 seconds she had before her husband arrived. He had seen soldiers do that, prepare for impact, accept it before it came. He did not look away from her face. My darling, Fenwick said, arriving beside her with a proprietary hand at the small of her back, and Aldric watched the slight tension around her eyes when that hand landed. I see you have found yourself in distinguished company. He turned his smile to Aldric then, wide, confident. the smile of a man who had never once genuinely feared the consequences of anything. He should have feared them tonight. Aldric looked at him with the same grey, unhurried gaze he used for everything, and said pleasantly, "Calloway, we were just speaking about property rights in the eastern parishes. Your wife has a remarkable grasp of the subject." Fenwick blinked. Séraphin blinked. "Does she?" Fenwick said. "Remarkably so," Aldric said. He looked back at Séraphin, then just briefly, just long enough to let her see that the exchange had been entirely intentional. A gift of credibility slipped quietly into her hands, costing him nothing and her nothing, and meaning everything in the architecture of the moment. Her lips parted slightly. He inclined his head once, in a way that was not quite a bow, and excused himself with the unhurried ease of a man who had accomplished exactly what he came to accomplish, and was now moving toward whatever came next. He did not look back. But he was already thinking about the bruise, about the 3 years, about the way she had said, "You cannot help me," as though she had needed to convince herself as much as him. There was a great deal Aldric Beausoleil intended to find out about Lord Fenwick Calloway, and the man was not going to enjoy a single moment of it. What exactly does Aldric do next? And what happens when Fenwick realizes that the Duke of Ravenshire has taken an interest in his wife that no amount of social charm is going to redirect? Subscribe now. Fenwick came to her room that night. She had been expecting it. She had learned to read the particular quality of his silence at social events, ways sailors learn to read the sky. Certain configurations meant safety, others meant you found shelter, and you found it quickly. Tonight he had been too quiet on the carriage ride home. Too still. The kind of stillness that was not peace but pressure, building behind a surface that had not yet decided where to crack. She was sitting at her vanity, unpinning her hair with methodical fingers, when the door opened without a knock. It never came with a knock. Knocking implied that her answer might matter. She met his eyes in the mirror and kept her hands moving, steady, unhurried. She had learned that stillness read as guilt, and movement read as indifference, and indifference was the only thing that occasionally gave him nothing to grip. "You were speaking with Beausoleil for a considerable amount of time," he said. "He approached me," she said. "It would have been remarked upon to walk away from a duke." "What did he want?" "To discuss parish property rights, as you heard." Fenwick moved into the room slowly, the way he always moved when he was deciding something, and she tracked him in the mirror without appearing to track him, a skill she had developed with the grim dedication of pure necessity. He stopped behind her chair, close enough that she could see his reflection clearly, handsome still, objectively, in the way that certain damaged things retained the appearance of their original form long after the structure had rotted entirely. "He was looking at you," Fenwick said. "Before he came down, I saw him on the landing. I cannot control where the Duke of Ravenshire directs his eyes." The silence stretched. She set down the last pin and reached for her brush and kept her breathing even, kept her face composed, kept the whole careful construction of her expression exactly where it needed to be. His hand came down on her shoulder, not violently. That was the particular sophistication of Fenwick's cruelty. It so rarely began violently. It began with weight, with the demonstration of presence, with the reminder, delivered through pressure rather than words, that her body existed within his jurisdiction, and he could remind her of that fact whenever the mood struck him. She did not flinch. She had trained the flinch out of herself. "You will not speak with him again," Fenwick said. "Of course," she said. His hand tightened briefly, then released. He stepped back. She heard him cross the room and close the connecting door behind him, and she sat very still for a long moment, brush in hand, looking at her own reflection with the detached curiosity of someone examining a stranger. She was so tired, not the kind of tired that sleep addressed, the kind that lived in the bones, in the particular exhaustion of perpetual performance, of existing in a constant state of managed threat. She had been tired like this for so long that she had stopped recognizing it as abnormal. It had simply become the texture of her life. She thought, without meaning to, of Aldric Beausoleil's voice, plain and unhurried. I think you have been carrying it alone for long enough that you have started to believe that is the only way it can be carried. She pressed her hand flat against the vanity surface and looked at the bruise on her wrist, the glove now removed, the discoloration livid and honest in the candlelight. She had never shown anyone, not Celestine, not her mother, not the physician she saw for minor ailments, whose kind eyes she had looked directly into while explaining that she bruised easily, always had, nothing to be concerned about. One man who did not know her had looked at her for 7 minutes across a ballroom, and seen what 3 years of proximity had not produced in a single other human being. She did not know what to do with that. She did not know what to do with any of it. With the way he had looked at her, with the words he had placed quietly into her hands, with the entirely irrational and deeply inconvenient warmth that had moved through her, when he had constructed that small, elegant lie about property rights, and handed her back her dignity without making a production of it, she had not felt her own dignity in a long time. It was a dangerous thing to feel it again. Dangerous because things you had stopped expecting hurt considerably more when they arrived than things you had always had. She knew better than to reach for it. She knew better than to reach for anything that Aldric Beausoleil was offering, whatever that was, whatever it meant, whatever the cost of it turned out to be. She knew better. She picked up the brush and began to draw it through her hair, and told herself firmly that tomorrow she would return to invisibility and performance and the careful managed survival that had carried her this far. She told herself this with great conviction. She almost believed it. 3 streets away, in the dark of his private study, Aldric Beausoleil sat behind his desk with a single candle burning and looked at the name he had written on the paper in front of him. Lord Fenwick Calloway. Beneath it, in his precise and unhurried hand, the beginnings of a list. He was not a man who acted on feeling. He was a man who acted on information, and information required gathering, and gathering required patience, and patience was perhaps the one thing Aldric possessed in genuinely inexhaustible supply. He would not rush this. Rushing produced errors, and errors in situations like this one, situations involving a woman who had no idea how much danger she was in simply from being in proximity to a man who had now decided to pay attention, were not acceptable. He stared at the name on the paper for a long moment. Then he added a second line beneath the list. It read simply, "Find Séraphin Dallaire," because Séraphin had mentioned a sister once, briefly, in the carriage conversation he had arranged to overhear 3 weeks ago, when he had first noticed something wrong in the way Calloway spoke about his wife at Lord Renard's dinner. He had been paying attention for 3 weeks. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to act. The right moment, he had decided tonight, was now. He folded the paper, blew out the candle, sat in the dark for a moment, with the particular focused stillness of a man who has committed to a course of action and is now simply calculating the most efficient path from here to its conclusion. Fenwick Calloway had made a significant error tonight. He had let Aldric Beausoleil see what he had done to his wife, and he had absolutely no idea what that was going to cost him. What does Aldric discover when he finds Celestine? And what secret has Séraphin been protecting that changes everything Aldric thought he understood about just how deep this goes? Séraphin Dallaire lived in a boarding house on the quieter edge of the city, in 2 rooms that cost slightly more than she could afford and slightly less than her dignity required her to admit she could not manage. Aldric found her on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the Ashford Hall ball, through a combination of financial record inquiry and one conversation with a solicitor who had handled the Dallaire estate dissolution and who had required only moderate pressure before becoming remarkably forthcoming. She opened the door herself, no staff, no pretense. A woman of 28 with her sister's dark hair and considerably less of her sister's composure, which Aldric found immediately informative. It meant Celestine had not had the same years of practice, which meant she had not needed them, which meant she had been kept at a distance from whatever was happening inside the Calloway household by design rather than circumstance. She looked at him on the doorstep and said, with the directness of someone who had stopped having the energy for social performance some time ago, "You are Beausoleil." "I am," he said. "You were with Séraphin at the ball." "I was." She studied him for a moment with eyes that were sharper than her circumstances, suggested she had any reason to still be. Then she stepped back and let him in. What she told him over the next 40 minutes rearranged several things he thought he had already understood. It had not begun with Fenwick. That was the first thing. The Dallaire family had carried a debt, obscure, decades old, originating with Séraphin's father in the final years of his life, when his love of books had expanded into a love of certain financial ventures that had not survived contact with reality. The debt had been purchased, quietly, efficiently, by a man who understood that debt was not simply a financial instrument but a behavioral one, that the right debt, held over the right family, produced a specific and reliable kind of compliance. That man was not Fenwick Calloway. Fenwick was the mechanism, the visible instrument, the hand. The name behind the debt was Lord Edouard Presso, Countess Madeleine's husband, the man who smiled at every social gathering with the mild benevolence of someone entirely comfortable with the amount of power he held, because he held enough of it that comfort was simply his natural atmospheric condition. Aldric sat with this information for a long moment. Presso, who sat on 2 parliamentary committees, who had Fenwick Calloway's complete financial survival in his hands via 3 separate investments that Calloway could not liquidate without Presso's consent, who had, according to Celestine's account, been the architect of Séraphin's marriage from its very beginning, not for love of arrangement, but because a Calloway with a compliant, isolated wife was a Calloway who remained grateful, and a grateful Calloway voted the way he was directed to vote on matters that Presso found financially significant. Séraphin had not simply married a cruel man. She had been placed there, deliberately, by someone who needed her there and had used a dead man's debt and a desperate family's limited options to ensure she stayed. Celestine was crying quietly by the end of it. Not dramatically, the kind of crying that happens when something has been held for so long that the container finally develops a crack, and the leak is almost a relief even while it hurts. "She doesn't know about Presso," Celestine said. "She thinks it is only Fenwick. I found the documents in our mother's things after she passed last year. I didn't know how to tell her. I didn't know if telling her would make it better or worse, and I was afraid that if Fenwick found out she knew, he would." She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table. "She has spent 3 years believing this is simply her life, that she made a choice, and this is what choices cost." Aldric looked at the documents Celestine had placed in front of him. He read them with the careful, complete attention he gave everything, and when he was finished, he sat back and understood with cold clarity the full dimensions of what had been constructed around one woman who had been 21 years old and grieving her father and trying to save her family from ruin. He felt something in that deep, quiet, administratively controlled part of him move in a way that was no longer quiet at all. He took the documents. He called on Lord Presso that same afternoon. Presso received him in his private sitting room with the confidence of a man who could not immediately identify a reason to be concerned, and therefore had defaulted to graciousness. He was 60, silver-haired, possessed of the particular social ease of someone who had spent decades ensuring that the people around him were either useful or afraid. Aldric sat down across from him and placed the documents on the table between them without introduction. Presso looked at them. The graciousness receded. Something more careful moved in behind it. "Where did you get these?" he said. Not a question, a calculation. "That is not the relevant information," Aldric said. "The relevant information is what I intend to do with them." "And what is that?" Aldric looked at him with the grey, unhurried gaze that had ended more than one conversation permanently. "That depends entirely on what happens in the next 72 hours. Séraphin Calloway will be separated from her husband cleanly, with her reputation intact, with the Dallaire debt dissolved, and with enough financial settlement to establish an independent household. Fenwick Calloway will agree to this because you are going to explain to him that agreeing is in his interest. You are going to do this because the alternative is that these documents reach the Parliamentary Oversight Committee along with the 3 other pieces of documentation I have already assembled regarding your management of the Eastern Land contracts." The silence was very complete. "You would not," Presso said. "I have done considerably more for considerably less cause," Aldric said pleasantly. "I would encourage you not to test the premise." Presso looked at him for a long moment. Aldric watched him calculate, watched him assess the threat, weigh the credibility, measure the distance between what he stood to lose and what compliance would cost him. It was a readable process. Most people's calculations were, if you knew how to watch. "This is about the woman," Presso said finally, with the faint contempt of someone who had never once made a decision based on something as inefficient as conscience. "It is about several things," Aldric said. "She is among them." He left Presso's house 20 minutes later with a confirmation that the matter would be handled, and the specific, clean satisfaction of a man who had used the exact right tool for the exact right problem. He did not go home. He went to the Calloway townhouse and sent his card in and waited in the entrance hall with the patience of a man who had nowhere more important be until Séraphin appeared at the top of the stairs with carefully composed confusion on her face and came down to meet him. He told her plainly. All of it. Presso, the debt, the design, the 72 hours. He watched her face as she understood, watched the composure hold, then fracture, then hold again in a different configuration, something rawer beneath it now, something that was not performance. "You did this," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Yes, without asking me," he considered this. "Would you have let me ask you?" The silence was its own answer. She looked at him for a long time in the grey morning light of the entrance hall, this woman who had carried an impossible weight with impossible steadiness and had never once asked for help, because she had never once believed help was something the world was prepared to offer her. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally. Not the separation, not the logistics. He understood she meant something larger, the after. The version of herself that existed outside the walls she had built. The terrifying, necessary work of learning to take up space in a life that was actually hers. "No," he said, "but you will learn." He offered her his hand. Not romantically, not with declaration or performance. Simply an open hand in the grey morning light from a man who had decided 3 weeks ago that this woman deserved someone in her corner and had simply gone about the business of being that. She looked at his hand for a long moment. Then Séraphin Dallaire, who had survived 3 years of invisible pain through sheer determined will, who had smiled over screams and performed over grief, and kept herself standing through everything the world had placed on her shoulders, reached out and took it, not because she was certain, not because the fear was gone, because she was tired of carrying things alone, and because, for the first time in longer than she could remember, there was someone standing close enough to share the weight. What comes next for Séraphin in the life she is only just beginning to reclaim, and what does it mean for Aldric, when the ruthless distance he has always kept between himself and the world is no longer quite enough to hold against one woman who sees him as clearly as he sees her? The separation was handled in 61 hours, Aldric had said 72 and delivered in 61 because precision was a habit, and because every additional hour that Séraphin spent inside that house was an hour he found he had no patience for. The documents were signed, the debt was dissolved, the settlement was structured cleanly, enough to establish independence without the appearance of charity, which he understood mattered to her in ways she would never directly articulate, but that he had learned to read in the set of her jaw and the particular quality of her silences. Fenwick did not contest it. Presso had been persuasive. Séraphin moved into a modest townhouse on a quiet street with Celestine, who had arrived with 2 trunks and an expression of barely contained relief, and had spent the first evening walking through every room, touching the walls as though confirming they were real. Séraphin had watched her sister do this, and had not said anything, and had gone to bed that night in a room that locked from the inside with a key that belonged exclusively to her, and had lain in the dark for a long time simply breathing. In the morning she had unlocked the door herself. That felt important. The weeks that followed were strange in the specific way that freedom is strange when you have forgotten its texture. She made small decisions: what to eat for breakfast, whether to walk or take the carriage, which books to place on which shelves, and each one arrived with a faint disorientation, the feeling of a muscle being used after long disuse, tender and unfamiliar but functional. Strengthening. Celestine hovered for the first week and then relaxed into something warmer, and they began to speak to each other the way they had spoken as girls, without the careful management of what was safe to say, and Séraphin found that she had missed her sister with a depth she had not allowed herself to measure while she was inside it. She did not see Aldric for 19 days. She counted. She did not examine why she was counting, but she counted, and on the 19th day he appeared at her door in the late afternoon with no announcement and no particular expression, and she opened it and looked at him and felt the complicated, interior warmth that she had stopped pretending was not there. "You have been avoiding coming," she said. "I have been giving you time," he said. "There is a difference, yes," he agreed. "I was not certain you would want the version that was avoiding." She stepped back from the door. He came in. They sat in the small front parlour with tea that Celestine made with pointed cheerfulness before finding a pressing reason to be elsewhere, and Séraphin looked at Aldric Beausoleil in the ordinary afternoon light. Not candlelight, not ballroom chandeliers, just grey daylight through clean windows, and found that he looked the same, contained, deliberate, that quality of deep, unhurried attention that had undone her from across a room the first time, and continued to be unreasonably difficult to be in proximity to. "How are you?" he said. "I am learning," she said, "what it feels like to have a day that belongs to me, and it is quieter than I expected." She paused. "I mean that well," he nodded slowly. There was something different in him today, she thought. The distance he usually wore like a second coat was not entirely absent, but it was thinner, something closer to the surface. "I am not practiced at this," he said eventually, with the blunt honesty of a man who had decided that honesty was more efficient than its alternative. "Whatever this is, I want to be plain about that." "I know," she said. "I have spent a considerable number of years ensuring I did not require anything from anyone," he continued. "I was under the impression I had achieved it." "You have complicated that impression somewhat." She felt something loosen in her chest, warm and careful and very, very real. "You are telling me this because," she said softly, "because you deserve to know the truth of what you are dealing with," he said. "And because I would rather be honest with you than competent." Given the choice, she looked at him for a long moment, this man who had watched her from a landing and descended stairs, and handed her dignity back without ceremony, and dismantled the architecture of her captivity, with the calm efficiency of someone crossing items off a list. This man who had given her 19 days and called it time. "I spent 3 years becoming invisible," she said. "I was very good at it. I do not want to be good at it anymore. No, he said, I don't imagine you do. She reached across and placed her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. Not dramatically, simply, the way you place a hand where it belongs. He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat in the quiet afternoon light of a room that was hers, in a life that was hers, with the particular settled feeling of two people who have both survived considerable distances and arrived, improbably, at the same place. It was not an ending. It was the first day of something that did not yet have a name but did not need one, not yet. If you have been here from the beginning, thank you, truly, for staying. Séraphin and Aldric's story is not finished, and what comes next for them is bigger, messier, and more worth it than either of them knows. Subscribe, if you have not already, and come back for what happens when two people who have never needed anyone decide, quietly and irrevocably, that they need each other.